Hi everyone, I'm JP Grant,
I'm JT Cardwell.
and this is Behavior.
A symptom.
All right, let's do this. Our guest today is Elaine Wilson. Elaine grew up in two caves in the middle of the Utah desert, where she taught herself high school and spent most of her time writing both novels and music. In later years, as a mother of four, she attended Dixie State University and became the first creative writing graduate in the school's history. She completed 2 semesters of Carlow University's Creative Writing Masters of Fine Arts program, which included intense writing training in Dublin, Ireland, and graduated with her master's degree in educational psychology through the University of Utah. She is now a school counselor, professional writer, and public speaker. She's currently working on her PhD in psychophysiology, where her focus is PTSD from sexual trauma. Welcome, Elaine.
Thank you, guys. It's really nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining our podcast and kind of explaining your life.
No, I'm excited to do this. This has been something I've really been looking forward to, and it'll be really fun. So what do you guys want to know the most?
So I think it'd be best if you first kind of explain your background, your complicated history, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, well, I'll give you obviously the really shortened version. So my father was he joined the LDS Church when he was a teenager. He was a convert, and throughout the course of all that and having several children, he moved from Pennsylvania to Utah and threw himself into the LDS Church. My father, from all accounts now, and through my studies, it appears mostly that he was a schizophrenic. He was constantly having visions and hearing voices about what he needed to do to be the best son of God that he was meant to be. He firmly believed that he was supposed to be a prophet in the last days and lead people to Zion, and which is a place that all saints are told that they will gather in the last days. So he was told that that was his mission in life. And because of that, he started preparing both mentally and physically. We lived in West Jordan until I was 12 years old, and that is when my life completely upended and changed. He announced that all of a sudden we were moving to Moab, Utah. I had never even heard of Moab, Utah at this point. I was leaving the LDS Church, my friends. Now I had been homeschooled this whole time, or after first grade, I should say. And I say homeschooled very loosely because it was not schooling that my parents did. My mother was very overwhelmed with the large amount of children that my father kept wanting her to have, and she was trying to support the family. She would sew in her room for hours on end all day long, because Dave, my father, hereafter known as Dave, Dave would go in and out and just try to he would have jobs, and then he would get into fights with the bosses or whatever else and get fired. And so my mother tried desperately to support us through her sewing, but when he announced this, it was really traumatic for me. And I remember that. And there was another family that went with us, which was the Steeles. And they had some young children as well. And we all left West Jordan. We weren't allowed to tell anybody where we were going to, which was really strange for me. I just kept having to say Southern Utah. And people would ask me questions. And I'd say, I don't know. And it was really awkward for me. And we left on 4th of July, 1991. And I remember packing up the truck and everything and saying goodbye to my friends and driving for hours down there. And when we got there, the fireworks were going off. And I remember watching it from this upstairs window and just had no idea what was about to happen. The family that moved in with us, Bill was the father of the family. And the entire time that I had gotten to know his family right before we left West Jordan, they had been starting to tell me about Section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is LDS scripture. And I started reading it, and I was so confused because in there it is a revelation supposedly to Joseph Smith's wife, Emma, that lets or no, it's to Joseph Smith, and Emma is mentioned in it, but it's about plural wives and the importance of having more than one wife, and how Abraham did in the Bible, and it was of the Lord and such. And so basically it was this revelation that started Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy in the early LDS church. Now, I had never heard of such a thing. I had never heard of a man having more than one wife, and it was shocking to me. Now, when I lived in West Jordan and was interacting with Bill and his wife, I finally got the realization that Bill and his wife Margot wanted me to be their plural wife. I was 12 years old at the time, and Bill was 32. And so, but being this homeschooled 12-year-old who had no idea about love or anything, who desperately wanted people to like her, I took the attention at face value and thought it was awesome, and was just glad that somebody liked me. Somebody wanted me to be theirs. And, I had always felt rejected from my own father. And so this was a big deal. And of course, I knew instantly I had to hide this from Dave, because Dave didn't like any sign whatsoever that I ever even looked at a boy my own age. And so the night that we moved into the house is the night that Bill still started doing inappropriate things with me. He kissed me that first night. And I think about that. And I was 12 and he was 32. And I'm like, what in the hell were you thinking? But that's where that started. And he proceeded to rape me in the next few months as they lived there in that house with me. And it was all under the guise of, you're going to be my plural wife. This is acceptable. This is what is needed. I'm supposed to teach you these things. Of course, I hid it from my parents, because I knew after what David said, David basically told us that the only way to heal from sexual sin was blood atonement, which is also an early LDS teaching, in which you can't have any kind of forgiveness in heaven unless your own blood is spilt. And so Dave had always said that he, as our father and our patriarch, which is a word I loathe with all my being now, but he was allowed to take our life. He was allowed to perform blood atonement in order to save us. And so I knew beyond the shadow of a doubt that I could never tell him what was going on, that I would be blamed for what was happening. And so, but all I heard for months was talks by Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, the first two presidents of the LDS Church, about polygamy. I mean, we read those things every single night. And it was just a few months later, so right around Thanksgiving of 1991, when Bill and Margot left my home and joined the Apostolic United Brethren, which is the All Red group here in Utah. For anyone who's seen the television show Sister Wives, that is the group that they belong to. That is their religion, is the All Red group. And I have actually talked to Cody from the Sister Wives, and he remembers the whole situation that I'm about to talk about that happened there. And so they're proclaiming on TV about how we don't do underage marriages and courting. Well, in 1991, they sure did. And so that show is something that I've been forbidden to watch as a result, because my blood pressure rises. But anyway, so they left and they joined that group, and me and my family continued to live in the home in Moab. I continued to be sort of homeschooled. I was supposed to be in 7th grade at this point. I remember wishing I could attend junior high. And so in February of 1992, right around my 13th birthday, I found out that Bill had taken a 15-year-old girl from the All Red group named Evangeline, and he'd been living in her home the way he had lived in mine, and had taken her out of state. And there was a warrant out for his arrest because, of course, it was considered kidnapping. He was 33, I believe, by then, and she was 15. And they finally found them in Wyoming. She came home. He spent some time in jail, not because her parents pressed charges, but because the federal government pressed charges, because it was a federal charge of kidnapping. And she came home, and from what I understand, was pregnant with his child. And so this was a really, really big deal to me, because at the time I kept thinking, especially since everything that had happened between him and I, that I was meant to be his plural wife, and I didn't have a choice about that, especially now. And so I was always kind of waiting for them to come back and get me when I reached the age of 16. And so to hear that was really traumatizing for me and made me question a lot of things, and actually enabled me to let go of the idea of Bill and Margot as my plural family. But then, of course, with that came the guilt of what had happened. And in my mind, I had committed adultery, which again, I knew was going to be a sin in Dave's eyes that would require him to basically kill me. And so I never, ever said anything to him or Judy this whole time. Later that year, that summer, we were having issues with our landlord and we were being evicted. And the only place that we could go was a place called Rockland Ranch, because we had met this polygamous family who lived there. Now, they did live in caves. These had been blasted into the rock with dynamite and such. And Bob Foster was the head out there. He had 3 wives. And so 2 of his wives, one of them lived there part-time, one lived full-time. The third wife didn't live there hardly at all. And he had various children there. And those kids became my friends. They were the first real friends that I had in all of this, because they knew what it was like to live like this and to be surrounded by these types of people. And I am still friends with some of them to this day. And so we lived out there for about a year. Initially, when Dave moved us there, he refused to let us live in any of the homes that had been built inside the rock. And we camped outside for 2 weeks. It was August, and my mother had just had her 7th child, literally like the week before we moved. And my father delivered that child with my assistance. And that was the first time I had ever done that. And
Wow.
it was incredible, and it was crazy and stuff at the same time. And so he was born in that house. And then a week later, we go to this campsite. It was pretty traumatic. And finally, Dave gave in, and we lived in one of the homes for a year. And I enjoyed that year very much, because for the first time I got to be kind of a normal teenager, at least as normal of a teenager as polygamous children can be. Throughout all this, Dave didn't have a plural wife. He wanted one and was constantly telling us about how it was our fault that he didn't have one. It was a guilt trip nonstop and constantly about how he knew that this woman was supposed to be his plural wife and her family had disappeared. And he was just waiting for her and was so certain that she was madly in love with him, and he was madly in love with her. And so the reason why they weren't together was always because of us and our unrighteousness. And my mother, like, he constantly just really slammed that into her head too, that it was her and that she was just so unworthy of this. And because he was stuck with her, he couldn't get this plural wife that he wanted so badly. And so eventually he was going to leave. And there was one point, this is my favorite thing that happened, when we lived in Moab right before we left to go to Rockland Ranch, is Dave sat us all down and told us how we were so unrighteous that he needed to leave. He needed to go up into the mountains, pray, and see what he was going to do to be able to get his plural wife, and that my mother would need to pray and listen to the Spirit to see if he was ever supposed to come home. And I remember him leaving and being so ecstatic that he was gone. Like, nobody cared. None of us kids cared that he left. We were like, God, he's gone. We can live, we can talk, we can breathe. And so, he'd given us this big speech about how he's probably never going to come home because we're not righteous enough, blah, blah, blah. And then I was sitting there in my room. I was wearing shorts because I'm not allowed to wear shorts when he's around, listening to my music, having the best time. And one of my siblings came running up the stairs and was like, Dad's home. And my heart sank. I'm like, what do you mean he's home? And they're like, he just showed up. Some people just brought him. Dude had gotten sick off of the mountain water and was like puking his brains out and everything while he was trying to have a spiritual experience. And so he came home and promptly went to bed, where he made my mother take care of him because he was so sick. It's just like, I'm like, what if he was going out for spiritual experience? Why didn't God tell him that the water was bad? Like, I remember asking my mother, why didn't God tell him the water was bad if he's such a spiritual person? And she's like, well, I don't know.
Because of your unrighteousness.
Yes, that's what it was. He never attempted that again. It was, I'm like, wow. Like, I still remember that. And he was such a pompous ass, and then came crawling back, like literally could barely walk up the stairs to his room. So That was a good time. But yeah, so we lived at with the Fosters. If you see there's a show, and I'm not remembering the name of it, but there's a show right now, and I know it was mentioned, I believe, on your bias page that somebody had watched it with the Fosters and so I've watched it, and I definitely have lots of comments about that I'll reserve. But we lived there for a year, and Dave just couldn't handle the constant. He wasn't in charge there. Bob Foster was, and that really grated on Dave's nerves. And so there were some caves down the road from Rockland Ranch that had been blasted in, and he decided that we were just going to live there. And it was privately owned by a big rancher down there. And so he just hurried up and sent off a letter, hey, we want to live in your caves, and never heard back. And so Dave assumed that meant he could just go squat on the property for 7 years. And and moved us in there. And there was no running water or electricity at Rockland Ranch. They had electricity at night through a generator, and there was running water, carpet in there. They had tried really hard to make these some nice homes, and they succeeded. And from what I can tell now, like, they're even more beautiful than they were in the 90s and stuff, and they've done an excellent job with that. But these caves were literally just cement floors, a cement front to them, with some haphazard wooden doors, and the one cave had plastic windows and like fiberglass kind of thing. And yeah, we lived there for 7 years, and I was basically sequestered there. Dave eventually decided we were Native American, which that's another story. We're not. Just decided. Yeah, he had a revelation that we were Native American. We've since tested our DNA, and there's not a drop of Native American in us. So I'm personally thrilled, just simply because I like to be like, hell, man, like we told you. But
the test was wrong.
Yeah, I know, right? It's my unrighteousness coming through again. And so and I'm at peace with that, by the way. But it was, so we would go to powwows and stuff, and I can certainly talk about that more later if you like. That was the one bright spot in the 7 years.
He was that convinced.
Absolutely. And he took us to Sundance and everything. That was an experience in and of itself. It really, really was. He was thoroughly convinced. And so we were the white family that traipsed into the powwows. And, now I think about cultural appropriation, and I'm absolutely horrified. But at the time, I was just so glad to get out of the caves that I was like, all right. And I was the first one. I was the first one of the family. Dave loved using me as the guinea pig, as the oldest. And I had to go out and start dancing. And God, I looked horrible, like pale as hell, and didn't know how to dance. And I eventually learned, and I made friends, and they were very kind. They really were, considering that we were just some stupid ass white family from a cave that decided to parade our way in there. And but there were some people that were very kind to us, and I really appreciated that. But we stayed in these caves, and I realized about the age of 15 that I wanted to go to college someday, even though I was told that was impossible. I didn't have a social security number at this point, and so I didn't know how I was going to do anything. But I wanted to go to school and work in education, and so I started teaching myself school 6 days a week. I got books from the thrift store, like really, really old history books, like from the 50s, and shit that nobody wanted anymore. And taught myself. I would make myself 6 days a week sit down and do things, and make my mother give me tests and stuff like that, because I was determined to do that. And so in 1997, Dave actually suddenly swooped in with a GED book and was like, my friends have said you should take this, you should do this and make me look good. Like, that's literally basically what he was telling me. And so I studied that stupid demon GED book for months, and got excellent scores, I would say, for somebody who just taught themselves high school. And then, of course, Dave proceeded to take all the credit for it. We homeschooled my kids, and I'm like, we didn't homeschool anything. I did. But yeah, so that was my thing. And I mean, it was literally just days and days and days of nothingness, sitting in these caves, and going according to weather. There would be snow and mud and everything, or it would be pretty hot because it was the desert. The caves inside were cool or warm if you heated them up, but the bedroom cave where I was there with all of my siblings did not have any heating in it. There was no wood burning stove or anything like there was in the other cave where Dave was, of course. And so, but once me and all my siblings got in there, it would get pretty warm at night and stuff. And we would sleep in clothes and fleece jackets that didn't get changed for like sometimes 2 weeks at a time because we were just so cold. And I remember bathing in the winter was just like a bucket and you just kind of use a rag and do the best you could. And I remember seeing there would be like dirt at the hollow of my throat and my wrists and stuff like that, just because I literally didn't bathe sometimes for 2 weeks in the winter. And it was just, I the only thing I could do to not go crazy was to do the schoolwork. And I started writing stories. Like I was like, I'm going to write. And I had so many notebooks and I would use the pencils down to the literal last inch. And I still have those notebooks and the pencils stuck in the binding. And, I just would write all these stories to try to not be where I was. And my dream was, to get published eventually. And so I just kept writing, and Dave would always criticize that, be like, "Oh, you're probably writing romance novels, and that's just evil. Like anything romantic and romance was evil." And I was told that it didn't matter when I got married if I was in love with that person or not. That was not what God worried about. That was a worldly thing. That you should just marry somebody righteous, whoever God or your patriarch told you to, and just suck it up and deal. So I really rebelled against that. My dreams were of falling in love, of having somebody else in love with me and wanting me and desiring me. And so I wrote about that. That's what I wrote about. I also played the piano. We had a piano that had been my grandmother's in that cave. I played that for hours, and I started writing music and playing music by ear because there were 2 music stations that we got. We had a big boom box that my grandfather had left for us. It was from like the 80s. It took these D batteries. And if you sat it in one corner of the bedroom cave, we would get a station, a country music station from Cortez, Colorado, or a classical music station from Salt Lake City. And Dave preferred we listen to the classical music one, but we would just listen to the country one whenever he wasn't around. And so 90s country is something that I associate with the caves. It's taken me a lot of years to be able to listen to a lot of that music because it will instantly take me back. Some songs I still can't listen to, but I've gotten so much better and I'm able to listen to most of them. But those are the songs that I used to play on the piano all the time. And me and my siblings would create all these imaginary things. We literally had nothing else to do. We would hike and we would see what was going on around us and things like that. We had goats that we were raising. My sister really got into that. She still raises goats. She has the descendants from the goats in the caves that she has with her now. She has a ranch with her fiance and they have lots of goats. So it was just a matter of surviving. Like I made a couple of friends here and there at powwows and I would write to them, and we had a P.O. box that Dave would allow mail to come in and out of. In 1999, right before I turned 20, some people had driven by because they had known the Fosters from up the road, and they stopped and they met my family, and they told me that they had 3 sons about my age, and the mom was very sweet, very kind, and she said, "I want you to meet my oldest son." And she brought them down a couple of weeks later, and I met the oldest son, and he was nice and everything, but it was the second oldest son that I ended up falling for, and he fell for me. And we started, I don't know what you would call it. It wasn't dating, and it wasn't even courting in the traditional sense because we were never allowed to go out alone anywhere. So, and I was 20 at the time, right? But we'd go hiking with my siblings and we'd go off by ourselves and then come back to the siblings and then all come back together. So Dave would never know. And he would come down to visit me every couple of weeks and we would exchange letters. And eventually he asked me to marry him. And when he did, I said yes. And I knew that because Dave had not chosen him as my husband, that he would not be okay with this. And by this point, for the last couple of years, I had been questioning Dave a lot and all of his stupid ideas and his teaching at us and the way that he would treat my mother and the way that he would treat us. And I would talk back to him all the time. And it created a lot of contention in the house, which I know was really stressful for my mother. But I was done. I was done listening to this old man just proclaim and just demonize everything but himself. And so this young man, Chris, and we went to him and told him that we were engaged and we wanted to still be part of the family. And Dave's like, Elaine knows that's not possible. And proceeded on a tirade to let me know what an evil young woman I was, how disappointed he was, that it was because I listened to country music that I fell for this guy because I didn't know what real godly love was. And this was December 28th, 1999, and I was disowned that day. And I walked out and had to leave my siblings behind, which was the hardest thing I had ever done. But I knew I had finally realized that the only way to get my siblings out was for me to get out first and create a way to get them out, because my mother was never going to leave, ever. And so I left that day and never went back. And by then they were leaving the cave. The owner had finally decided that he wanted his own sheep herders to live there and told Dave he could go. And so Dave found another place to squat up the road. There was a trailer that had been abandoned, and Dave got the electricity, or the electricity was hooked up to it because somebody else had kind of been squatting there. And so Dave hurry up and moved into that. And because he didn't work, he didn't actually go to work. He gave his social security number back, according to him, to the government because he said it was theirs and not his, blah, blah, blah. And so he couldn't work. He had to work under the table. He had to work construction on the table. And there were times when I had no idea how we were going to get food. And he'd eventually hurry up and get some measly little job and make some money and go buy peanut butter and 7-grain oatmeal. And that's basically what we lived off of, that and potatoes for I don't know how long. And so me leaving, I was really concerned about the health and safety of my siblings, but I knew I had to go. And so I did, and I married this guy. We were married for 13 years and had 4 children. And we've been divorced since 2013, and we co-parent our kids. He lives near me, and he's remarried to a really nice woman, and he's very happy, and I'm remarried. And so, yeah, that's escaping the caves. But there was a lot that happened that I had to go back and get my mother and my siblings, and we can go over that if you want to. But that's, like I said, that's a brief synopsis of my 7 years in the cave and time with polygamy.
Wow, that's absolutely insane.
Yeah.
A little
That's
bit,
a crazy story.
A little bit.
Wow, Elaine, there's so much in that story that is just like, wow, like that would be worth asking questions about, and we could have a conversation forever about everything.
Yeah.
It's hard to pick which thing I would like to ask you about, but just based on the story that you just told, there were a couple things that jumped out at me, and I know some things jumped out at Jeremy. But one of them was like your mom in all this. She was ever present. She was there. But obviously, it seems like the dad was a force that she was not up to confronting or challenging. You said she was never going to leave. Why do you say she was never going to leave?
So my mom, Dave picked his victims very well. I really believe that the biggest reason he was drawn to her is because he could control her. I mean, she was a very vivacious, lively, wonderful young woman, from what I understand, as a teenager and young college student. And Dave met her at a LDS church activity and broke up with her for a little while and came back. And Dave was he was very controlling. From what I understand, she didn't have the strongest examples of parents as a good relationship. And especially this is back in the 70s, we didn't know then as much as we know now about, women standing up for themselves and being that way. And so,
right.
Her personality was such that I don't know that she really knew how to stand up to him, even with her children. And that's something I have really struggled with her, of the things that she literally sometimes stood there and allowed to have happen since I took her away, Dave, and she has since recreated her life and is incredibly happy and vivacious again. And she's with a man who loves her incredibly, and also came out of an abusive relationship. So he was the one being abused. So they work really well together, knowing where that came from. And so she's very happy now. And so I've done a lot of work on myself in order to be in her life. She's an excellent grandmother to my children. And
That's awesome.
I honor that. Like, my kids love her, and she loves them. And she's tried very hard to, especially through my recent cancer diagnosis, to be the kind of mom, that I think she always wanted to be. She's been very supportive and worked hard. But throughout all of this, I was the one that stood up to Dave, and I was the one that said things, and I was the one that got angry at her when he would just do some awful, awful shit, and she would literally beg him to come back to us after he would treat us so terribly, because he would stomp out and leave and be like, well, fine, I guess my family hates me. And I'd be like, yeah, you're right, they do. And and that's the funniest thing is that he tried so hard to raise women who were completely submissive
Mm-hmm.
and would bow to anything. And by so doing, he has raised some of the most stubborn ass women that you have ever met. And it really backfired on him the best way. And so, that's who I was. That's the kind of person I became with him. And I needed to be that for my siblings because she couldn't be. So I try not to too much about her story and what she was thinking. One, because it causes me a lot of pain, and just, I don't know. I honestly can't understand, as a mother myself, how some of the things that happen possibly happen. But go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that you said really resonated with me, that, in that time, and certainly in that religious context, the idea of a woman standing up to the man, or even arguing maybe, is not a thought that would have occurred to her. It was just not an option in your consciousness.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah. Well, and then if I can ask a follow-up question there based on what you just said, you also talked about in the story how something at some point, like you mentioned, as when you were 20, you had arrived to an age or a mental mindset where you now were looking at Dave critically. You were now thinking like you were almost oppositional to him at that point. Like, but
Yes.
but when did that start? Like, were you
and what kind of like fueled it too? Because I'm curious, like, what was it that drove you to stand up to him? Since your mother couldn't do it, like there wasn't really an example. So what was it, that catalyst for you?
Well, I think my own personal stubbornness, and you're well aware of this, Jeremy, as one of my friends, at how real that can be. And I think that just really started coming out. Ironically, I was a lot like him. And so as I would grow up when I was a teenager, I remember asking him questions and challenging him. Like when he would say things like, the moon isn't real, that's just a hologram in the sky. That they said that God had taken the moon away before even the moon, which is why the moon landing was fake. And because it wasn't there, the moon wasn't there, it was a hologram. And I remember saying, well, wait a minute, they didn't have the technology back in the 40s to create a hologram that would suddenly shine over the entire earth and still affect tides, right? And I remember saying, how is that even possible? And the answer I got was, well, it just is. I was like, So, and so I would ask these questions, very angry. And I remember he gave us the stupidest lesson once when I was 12, and repeated it a couple of years later, about how you get points in heaven. You get points with God if you do certain things. So if you kiss somebody on the forehead or the cheek, you get a certain amount of points. But if you kiss them on the lips, you get more points, and a hug is worth it. And I remember going,
wow.
What? And so it's like a football game. God plays like a football game, and Dave just got so irate and shouted at me, I'm just not going to teach you anything else. I'm like, well, if it's like that, then that's fine. He didn't like that at all. Like, it was a constant battle. And I think part of the biggest was I literally started thinking for myself. I would read and I would write, and I just remember going, this doesn't sound right. This isn't, why do other people do this then? Why is it different this way? And I would constantly ask questions, constantly be told I was going to hell for these questions, and disbelieving. And so I just kept going. And there was kind of a perverse satisfaction the more I got older and realized what an ass my father was. There was this perverse satisfaction in riling him up. And it gave me such joy that, that we realized once we would start listening to him talk to other people about how he had a like we were robots. And I remember him telling somebody, "Oh, I don't have to do anything. I can call my children by name and they'll stop what they're doing. And they just, they know exactly what I mean when I say it." And that ticked us off so much that we started this game that from then on, every time he called our name, we'd be like, "Yes, what? What did you want? I don't understand. What were you asking? Why aren't you talking now?" And it would piss him the hell off. And so we all did it. It became like this game because we realized what an ass our father was. And so I started asking questions.
Trolling your father.
Yeah, exactly.
It sounds kind of like what POWs do, like during the time of war. Like you're supposed to resist in like little ways and having little wins. So maybe like those little wins were things that kept you all going and kept you all in good spirits, because I have a feeling that a lot of people would become very depressed and very distraught at their situation and maybe not even want to go on.
Yeah, no, and I definitely suffered depression. I knew I was missing out on life, and it's my biggest regret that can never come back. When I watch my daughter, like even in simple things at high school, and I work in a high school, and so I watch all these kids do, and I'm like, they don't recognize, and it's such a simple thing, but it's a cultural thing, and it was a big deal to me, and I will never, ever, ever get those years back, no matter what, and I'll never get to have those experiences, and so it is what it is, and it's made me who I am, and I'm trying to move forward with that. But it was a way of being able to survive, because constantly challenging him made me feel alive. It made me feel like I wasn't becoming the robot that I had seen my mother become. And because she would tell us about her teenage years and stuff, and I'd be like, "What happened?" Because she had just lost so much of who she was, and I absolutely refused to be like that. And then once I started being told that I wasn't allowed to fall in love, and, that he was going to choose my husband, I was like, fuck that shit. That wasn't going to happen. So that was my biggest deal, is fighting against that particular idea that he could choose my husband and I would be trapped with somebody of his choosing. And so I just started fighting and fighting back. And I remember on my 20th birthday, my mother begging me and my father to fast, pray to try to bring peace back to the family. I was like, no, I won't. I will not, because I am not going to give in to him. I never will. And it was hurtful for her. I know she was doing what she thought was best, but I couldn't do it. So yeah, I'm the evil one. And he's still, to this day, when the article that you guys have mentioned was released, somebody, whoever is living with him, actually tried to leave a comment on the article, and I had access to the spam comments, saw them, and whoever it was claimed to be living with my father and saying that I was a complete and absolute liar, that none of this had happened, that Dave had only ever been trying to protect me as his daughter, and I had led the strain. It was just this rant and vile view of complete and absolute lies that this person believed from Dave. And I was just like, Dave honestly believes these things about himself, and I hope he hears this, and I hope he does, because he is one sick motherfucker, and I hope that he is enraged by hearing me tell the truth about what he did, because he doesn't see it, and he thinks that I am the evil woman that led his family astray, and I wear that badge proudly. So
yeah,
you definitely do. You're definitely a voice of opposition ever since we met.
Yes, that is good.
I want to ask, so before the voice of opposition came, before you became critical of him and everything that was going on in your lives, was it not your normal? Did you not adopt these ideas as your own and internalize it?
In some ways I did. The polygamy thing, like I said, that I believe I adopted in my head simply because at that time Bill and Margot were there, and that fit, that made me feel like I fit in, that made me feel important. And when they left and that was all going, I remember questioning it and thinking of polygamy with huge dread, because I was told that I had to do this. And all my teenage years, I was told I had to do this. And even when I married my first husband, I still thought in the back of my head, because I had been told all this time that there was this guilt. I had been told for years that I had to be a plural wife or have a plural wife in order to get to the celestial kingdom and keep whatever children and family that I had. Which is a little bit about what I discussed with you earlier, JT, about how I see that religious polygamy differently from ethical non-monogamy, which we can talk about. But so I was told I had to do this in order to be able to actually keep my family. And so I still thought that when I left, and it wasn't too long after I left that I was like, yeah, I don't think so, but there were a few things like that I did adopt. I firmly believed at the time in the legitimacy of Joseph Smith, and the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, and of course God's ability to smite me at any time. But whatever I believed in that, it still wasn't enough to stop me questioning Dave. And I started seeing Dave as something that God would never have agreed upon. And so that's how I was able to separate that. But there was definitely, years of thinking, okay, yes, polygamy is right. God is right. Joseph Smith is right. Dave might be right about some things too. Because, having been abused by him all my life, it did take some time for me to be able to stand up to him. And the things that made me start standing up to him is watching him abuse my younger siblings and watching my mother do nothing. And that enraged me so much. And I started stepping in. And once I realized I could survive that, I started recognizing that I could intimidate Dave sometimes. And I would build on that because I started realizing that he would take a step back when I would stand up or question. That's when that started to really grow. But for sure, it took a lot of time to unindoctrinate myself from a lot of things that he taught me.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm sure you felt powerful as you saw the power leaving him when you were able to confront him and make him step back.
I did. And it made me realize I can do things. I can do what I need to do to protect these people. And the most glorious moment came when I rescued my siblings from him. And that was the ultimate transfer of power in my mind when he was carted off in a sheriff's car, handcuffed.
So he did go to prison for at least a time. I mean, obviously he's out now.
Yes.
You had mentioned speaking to his current wife. So what happened? What transpired for that to occur?
Well, after I had been gone from home, it was 2007. I had just had my third child. My two sisters had also left by this point, and we wanted to get Judy and the remaining children out. There were two boys who were after the age of 16, so we knew that, especially since at this time they were very much indoctrinated with Dave, that there was no way we could get them out. They had a choice. Well, there were three younger ones that were ages, I believe, like 14 and 12 and 9.
And just to clarify, Judy was your mother? Is your mother, or Judy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And she was there, and I lied to her. We tried to get DCFS into the home. DCFS said, none of you have lived in the home in the last year, so we can't go according to what you're telling us. We can't go in and do anything. We need your mother to do a report. Well, that was never going to happen. She was waiting. She wanted out. She didn't want to be there, but at this point, she was literally just waiting for a sign or somebody to. She had mentioned, that there were signs that she should hang on a little longer, and I got the impression she was almost like waiting for an angel to come along. So here I came. I was the destroying angel. I didn't give shit. Like, I was the cussing angel, and I came in, and I said, "Look, I lied to her," and I said, "DCFS is coming to get your kids on this day. You can go with them or you can stay with your husband." What was it going to be? And I was really depending on her loyalty to her children that I knew was there. I knew she loved her children. And so she, of course, said, all right, well, I'll go. Getting her out of the house and taking the children with her would enable us to have them. And so we made plans. The day before we were supposed to go down and do it, I was talking to her on the phone. They had a phone in the trailer that they had moved into. One of my brothers got on the other line and was listening to our plans, and he threatened her and said, "You can't take Dad's kids. If you do, I've got a gun. I'll stop you." So instantly, me and my ex-husband went running down there to Moab. My mother had a thing where she tried to get the kids away. She tried to take them out anyway, because I said, "Get the kids out of there." My sister started screaming about not leaving her horse. Dave heard her, locked the kids up in the bedroom, my brother and a gun in the door, and said, "You're not taking my children. You can go wherever you want." My mother got a ride into Moab and stayed at the women's shelter, which is where I picked her up. So I remember walking into the shelter and seeing her sitting on the couch. And this was really, really hard for me. I had to keep a distance. I was really traumatized. That's why I had left my brand new baby at home, because I was not sure what Dave would do. And so we had to we couldn't just go take the kids now, because Dave was there. Dave had guns. And at this point, we were worried, because he, considered himself a Native American and has friends on the reservation, that he was going to just take the kids and disappear on the reservation. So we had to go further south into San Juan County and go to a judge. And my mother had to fill out a thing why she wanted the kids to be taken away. Well, all she put on there, still being indoctrinated by Dave at the time, all she put on there was, oh, he plays mind games. Well, no judge is going to take the kids away for that. And I remember getting really irate. And at this point, my mother had just barely found out. I had just barely told her, like a few days prior, when I was telling her about how she needed to leave with her kids. And she's like, oh, you think your upbringing was so bad because you missed out on, going to high school, but your upbringing wasn't that bad. And I lost my shit on her and told her about how I had been raped by this guy who had been there, and all these people that had since come into our lives, because there were several more men who looked at me as a potential plural wife when I was 14 years old.
Oh
and this
my
was
God.
a constant. And they were all in their 40s, for God's sake. I mean, it was just nasty.
God.
And I felt so gross, and like, will anybody my age actually, want me? And so anyway, so this was a thing, and I had exploded on her. And so at this point, I was really super angry with her, and feeling I didn't like that I had to finally give this secret up in order to convince her that it was time. And so we had to spend the night at a friend's house down there, who she's been like a foster mom to me. This whole time. She hated Dave after she realized who he really was. And she was there at my wedding to my first husband as my mother, and was this wonderful woman who helped us. And so we stayed at her home, and we got a victims advocacy person to come and help my mother fill out the forms that she needed in order to get custody of her children. And it was very hard. I mean, I was actually removed from the room at one point because she just kept saying nice things about my father, and he's a good man, and I don't want any harm to come to him. And I'm like, you have got to be fucking kidding me right now. Like, I was screaming at her, this is what your husband does. This is what you've told me. Do you remember these things? Oh, it was really hard. She was in shell shock. She was a victim herself. She was in shell shock. She was being pulled out, and she didn't know what the hell was going on. And I did. And I had lost my patience at this point. I was sick, worried about my siblings, what could possibly be happening to them. So they actually had to remove me from the room at one point. And finally, we went down to the judge and got the proper orders. DCFS went with us, and they left me up the road and said, we're going to go get your siblings. You can't be there. We don't want you there. And so we'll come back and get you. And from what I've been told happened, she tried to go into the house, and Dave went running after her. So the cops grabbed him. He started resisting arrest, which is never your best plan. But Dave is above the law. So Dave started doing that. I guess he screamed, look what they are doing to your father. He considers him this huge godly man who's being made an example of, basically a martyr. And they threw him in the sheriff's car with handcuffs. And so when I pulled up, Dave at this point, I'm sure, suspected that I was involved. But it wasn't until I pulled up and I got out of the car that he saw me. And the look on his face was so satisfying. He was enraged beyond belief to see me come out of that car. And he leaned out the car window and he screamed, "You'll never win!" And I looked at him and I was like, Kate, dude, I'm leaving with your wife and children. You're going to jail. I think I did just win. And the cops were like, no, you can't talk to him. Like, stand over here. And like, they immediately separated us because I was like, let's go. Like, this is a great thing. You're in handcuffs. Take the handcuffs off. I'll do it right now. Like, I don't give a shit. Like, they're like, no, over here. And they went over to the car and asked my father if he had anything further to say. And he was like, no. So we got them out. We got their stuff out. And we drove straight back to Richfield, which is where I was living at the time. And I know my mother was so overwhelmed and scared and everything else like that. But I was also overwhelmed and had let a lot of secrets out that I had not intended on. And so I couldn't bring her to my house. I just couldn't. I knew that if she moved into my house, that they would be there. And I had built this new life without them. And I could not join those two worlds so immediately. And I took her to the women's shelter that night. And I know that was hard on her. But I just knew I was on the verge of a mental breakdown. And so I took her, and my one sister who lived there in Richfield with me helped, my friends helped, and they helped get them all settled in while I proceeded to have a mental breakdown. I was hospitalized not long after she moved in, just for a few hours, but I couldn't remember the names of my children, the birth dates. I kept saying the same things over and over. I was hallucinating in my head. It was this really weird experience that they took me to the hospital for. And after all this, and that's what started my years of therapy. But it was a good day. It was the best day. And to have that final thing. And then we did see Dave in court a few months later, where he wore his old LDS 3-piece church suit from the 70s, and he had his long Indian braids and looked absolutely goddamn ridiculous. And stood up there and talked about himself and how wonderful he was and what a good father he was.
Of course he did.
Yeah. And Judy had a lawyer. She got up there and she was very honest, and he had to cross-examine her, which I'm sure was not easy for her. And he was very mocking. And finally, at the end, the judge was like, well, your ex-wife is concerned that if we give you unsupervised visitation, you will take your children and run to the reservation. What do you have to say about that? And Dave gave a long-winded explanation about how the Lord works in mysterious ways and he can never tell what's going to happen. So the judge was like, okay, cool, supervised visitation it is. And Dave was stunned, and he turned and he looked at me, and I'm sure I had the most smug smile on my face. And I looked at him straight in his eyes, and then he completely avoided us and had to sign some papers. And, it was a beautiful moment, and that we got full custody of my siblings, and that we never really heard from him again. I know my siblings got some letters from him in which he talked about the evilness of me, and I have copies of them. They're beautiful things. Like, every once in a while when I want to reaffirm my evilness, I like to read them. But
all of your siblings, like, everybody got out and
everybody's
in communication with them.
Not true. Now, there are two that are in communication with him. One is one of the brothers that was there. He very much supports my father. He is also a rapist, and we've tried to prosecute him too. There are lots of things that have gone on in my family, and he's just as bad really as Dave, and he lives near Dave, which is how I believe Dave got a copy of the article, because my mother posted it. She's friends with this brother then I'm sure probably showed Dave, and I'm happy that he did. So hopefully he'll pass this along as well. But and then my brother that's just younger than me, who was kicked out before I left, he's been in and out of prison for some very serious crimes. And last I heard, he had found Dave's number and was calling him. So I'm sure Dave is looking for solace from at least, I guess, a couple of his children who, because the rest of us have all disowned him.
But all the daughters then?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. 1,000%. There are 4 of us, and not a single one of us want anything to do with him.
Wow.
For obvious reasons.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For definite obvious reasons.
Did you say he was like schizophrenic, Dave?
I would say, with my training in psychology and counseling since then, I would say, yeah. Dude was hearing voices all the time. He was having visions. He was told that he was going to see the Lord. The second coming was coming. Like, he's been promised that he will not die before seeing Jesus Christ. So I'm pretty certain what he's still waiting on. That and this girl that he thinks is still in love with him, God knows. So,
yeah.
But I did hear that he married once after Judy, and she died in a hospital with some complications from a pregnancy, from what I understand of his, that was twins. And I can honestly say, I'm grateful that she and these children that she were about to give him were spared from being with him, because I was very concerned about these future siblings of mine and their safety. And so it was actually a huge relief to my heart to know that he wouldn't be able to harm them.
Do you think over time he got worse, or did he kind of stay the same? Like, in the beginning, did it start off somewhat mild
It did
and then
seem to.
progress?
Yeah, I mean, he was always very physically abusive, even like when we were kids, he just was. But being around people and within a ward and within a neighborhood had to keep him in check. There were things that he couldn't do when there were people who were seeing us all the time, and when his parents, who were my only grandparents, who are amazing. Like, ironically, my father's parents were just the most amazing grandparents and believed in me 1000%. They thought I could do anything, and I miss them very, very much. But they did not approve. They didn't know most of what was going on. They didn't approve of the cave living. They visited us there twice, but they were also of the generation that you don't interfere in someone else's family. But that helped to keep him in check somewhat. And once that was gone, once he was able to move us out where other people weren't watching us, because we did get DCFS called on us, our family, a couple of different times.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
And
nothing.
It's still somehow persisted.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's Utah. To be perfectly honest,
what did DCFS do? Did they come to like the cave and
they did
examine?
They came to the cave and they still
and they
walked
thought
away.
That was adequate.
And DCFS didn't actually come. They sent the sheriff. They sent the local sheriff to us. Now, at the time when this happened, yeah, it's absolutely outrageous. But so DCFS, I guess, was called on us in West Jordan. We never really met with anybody. I don't know why they didn't follow up, but I heard that they had been called, and Dave was incredibly nervous and panicked. And maybe there was somebody who come to talk to us. I don't remember. But in the caves, DCFS was called on us, and it was the sheriff came out to sue us, and he warned us that he was coming. Like, we had a week's notice almost.
Wow.
Dave armed all of his children with guns. My 8-year-old sister had a gun in her fanny pack. The sheriff, I'm sure, didn't know this. Yeah, exactly, right? And here's what the really batshit insane thing is that he gave us commands. We were all trained the night before in commands to protect him. He was going to walk out and talk to the sheriff, and we all had to be there. And if he said if he gave a certain command, we were to scatter and hide. And then another command, we were supposed to get down on our knees and pull out our guns and point them at the sheriff. He was literally training all of his children to protect his ass. And he was going to expect all of his underage children to shoot the sheriff should he give the command.
Of course, you're his
That's crazy.
God Providence army, you know.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so, like, even my 8-year-old sister had a gun in her fanny pack, and I have a 9-year-old little girl, and I cannot imagine giving that child a gun. Like, no way in hell. And so, but he did, because I was him. So DCFS just sent the sheriff. He came and he talked to us for like 20 minutes. And he was on one side of the gate and we were on the other. He didn't come in. He didn't see the living conditions outside. I mean, he had to have seen how nasty they were outside. But again, this is Utah.
Well, that's still mind-boggling. Like, here in Virginia, Northern Virginia, I work with victim advocates, and I'm a mandatory reporter.
Mm-hmm.
And if I suspect anything with children, like mental abuse or physical abuse or anything, I have to report, and if I don't, then I am liable to go to prison if it comes out later.
Yes.
So, like, at that point in time, were there no like mandatory reporter laws? I don't really know much about laws in Utah.
I don't know. I mean, I'm a mandatory reporter as I'm a school counselor, and I have been for years. But the thing is that we didn't go to school. We didn't go to church. Nobody saw us. It was I believe it was some people from Rockland Ranch who called DCFS. And if they do, thank you very much for at least trying. Well,
I'm saying for the
sheriff.
Yeah.
The sheriff
do you think?
shows up.
Yeah. Don't you think he'd think? But no, he literally,
because he knew you had kids. He knew that this person had kids, correct? That Dave had kids.
Yeah, he met with all of us. He met with all of us outside. He did not come inside. He did not come in and see the squalor that was what we were living in. But he should have. I mean, if you look at pictures, I look at pictures now from the outside, and I'm like, good God, that is horrific. Like, the garbage and the stuff that was where we lived. I mean, we're living without running water and electricity. Why was this not a problem for San Juan County?
Which, do you mind if we put those up on the website?
No, not at all.
On our page, can we?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'll make sure.
So we can show
those.
everybody listening like the pictures of the cave that she actually lived in.
Yeah, I
which
have
also
some.
was radioactive. Is that
Yes, it was
you said that you
discovered.
learned that recently?
Yeah, within the last year, I had a friend whose boyfriend works for National Geographic and was exploring a lot of areas in southern Utah, and he came back with a radioactive report of my caves, and it was high. It was very high, and yeah, and he took some pictures and stuff, and the report was really quite disturbing. And then it wasn't too long after that I discovered I had cancer. So I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that contributed to it. Obviously, so far, no one else, including my mother, has been diagnosed with cancer. So I don't know. It's very, yeah, I mean, we'll never know, obviously, but I can't
but
help
it's
but
disturbing
think, yeah,
nonetheless.
absolutely. I'm like, what is this?
Yet another
Just one
crazy
more-
detail.
Yeah, one more box in the craziness of the caves.
Man.
Wow. So now you're going around. Well, you work as a school counselor,
Mhm.
but you are also an activist in this area.
Yes.
Trying to expose the ills of non-ethical polyamorous relationships. Which could you just tell us a little more about like your mission? Like, what do you hope to kind of get out of this, and what do you hope to spread awareness of?
Well, mostly because I'm surrounded by Warren Jeffs and the Colorado City thing. I'm in southern Utah, which actually spreads throughout Utah. You got a lot of polygamous groups now. As I stated in my article, and I know there was some question about this, about how I completely 1000% support consenting adult relationships, whether it's polyamory, same-sex marriage, things like that. That's not a problem. Like, I'm bisexual myself. Of course I support and live these things, and people wonder, well, what's the difference? And the thing that I'm trying to help people recognize is that the religious polygamy within these religions that are so predominant in Utah, they are all broken off from the early LDS church, all of them, every single one, the All Red group, the Harmston group, Colorado City. There are so many of them, and they're all broken off from the early teachings of Joseph Smith. Every single one of them, because the church eventually said no more polygamy, and there were people with plural wives who were like, well, I'm not giving up my plural wives, I'm not giving up polygamy. I went and started their own groups. And there were people who started their own groups before that. There were people who started their own groups when Joseph Smith was alive, right? Like, that's what happens in major religions. There's all these breakoffs. And,
Absolutely.
And the thing about this religion is that is not full consent. When you are told as an adult woman, and especially as you grow up within the religion, you're told, if you don't do this, you are not going to have your children in the afterlife. You're not going to have your eternal reward. You're going to go to hell or the celestial kingdom, which is a lower thing. Basically, you're being emotionally manipulated and being told, if you don't do this, then you don't get these rewards. You don't get to have your family in heaven. And, it's a really big deal. It is a real thing to these people who grew up in the religion, which it was for me at first too. I was like, oh, I have to do this, because if I don't, then I'm going to lose my celestial reward and such like that. And, they're told that this is the way it has to be. And another inequality about it is that the women are not allowed to have multiple partners. It is just a man who's allowed. Now, if somebody chooses in a non-religious way to have a man and several women, I really don't freaking care, as long as they're all consenting adults. But the thing about this religion is that it is mandated that it is just a man and several women, and that is not an equal relationship. Therefore, it is not a consensual relationship, in that they aren't given a choice. If these women were given a choice to have another partner and they're like, yeah, no, I don't want it, that's completely different. But these women are told that this is the way it's going to be. It's always going to be just multiple women. Most of the women in most of these groups do not get a say when their husband takes another wife. That is not a consensual relationship. When you get no say in who your husband brings home and suddenly starts having children with, and you're literally living with this person or nearby them. And so that is not consensual. So that's not consenting adults. And that's what
basically
I want.
Making the difference between an enforced kind of polyamorous relationship, which is kind of what you were forced into,
Yes,
versus an ethical one where the partners decide.
yeah, exactly. We're two, and I know lots of people in ethical non-monogamy, lots of them. My husband and I have been in open relationships before. Like we understand this and we agree to it and we love that aspect of it because there isn't this religious, you will do this. And, and then of course, my biggest thing in all of this is to raise awareness for the child brides, which are clearly not consensual relationships. The adults, again, most of them have been child brides, and that's why I feel the need to help rescue them and stuff like that too, if at all possible. But we're talking child sex trafficking and these children who are being passed along and saying, I was looked at as a prize because I was a 14-year-old virgin. And I was literally something that everybody wanted to get. I was the ultimate, oh yes. And so, you may have heard about the lost boys that come from Colorado City, where they're literally just dropped off in St. George or anywhere amongst, in Vegas and stuff like that, because they're young men who are going to be wanting wives, and they of course can want wives their own age. And that is in direct competition with these old men who are looking for these. And I've seen that. Like I said, I had multiple old men in their 40s looking at me when I was 14 and writing me love notes and wanting me and giving me gifts. And it was so disgusting. And my parents let that come around.
That's so creepy.
It really is. If somebody tried to do that to my daughter now, and she's 17, I would be after them in 2 seconds. They would be very sorry they ever spoke to my child. So, it's just, so that's what I'm really wanting, is the awareness of these child brides and the human sex trafficking, and that this needs to stop. But the state of Utah does not want to touch this. This religion stems from the main religion in this state where we have our headquarters, which is LDS. And it's a really big deal. I mean, I don't know if you remember what happened in Texas, where they did go to one of the FLDS compounds and take a whole bunch of children out. Those children were sent back. Even after telling horror stories, the state forced them all to go back. And sometimes they were handed over to people who couldn't even prove they were their parents. Somebody just came and said, give me that child. And they got to go. And then they went and raided the temple. Yeah. And they raided the temple and found tapes in which Warren Jeffs had recorded himself raping his newest 12-year-old bride. I mean, in the temple. And yet we're not concerned enough to take these children away. And it's a real thing for me. So me and others have spoken out about this many, many times. And there is actually a child sex trafficking coalition up here that they're working against that I want to work closely with. But with my recent health problems, I haven't been able to initiate that yet. But by public speaking, I want my story to be heard. And another reason why I like to share my story is because as a psychologist, I believe it's so important for victims to be able to own their story and to take their power back by owning their story. And that's what I've tried to do, is when I share my particular story, there are some that are far worse than mine, way worse than mine, but I still own my story, and I get to own that and say, I am no longer the victim. I have empowered myself by sharing the story. I will not hide the identities of the people involved, like Dave and Bill Steele and stuff like that, because they don't deserve to be hidden. And I have no problem talking about their wrongs, because if they didn't want it to be public, then they shouldn't have done it.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah. Shine a light on them and own your story. I think you're doing an amazing job doing that.
Thank you.
Obviously, speaking, getting your story out there, that's a huge component of raising the awareness of this sort of stuff. And the work that Coalition doing sounds awesome. But, there's the awareness component, but then is there any sort of legislative component that could help here that you guys are also advocating for?
I don't know. It's really complicated because, of course, they decriminalized polygamy and then criminalized it again. And I really do get why so many of these polygamists are coming forward and saying it's not fair to criminalize us for this. I think that there needs to be harsher punishment for these people who are marrying off young children, because that is happening frequently in this state. And that is what I want, is the human sex trafficking to be taken more seriously, for them to not shy away from the fact that it's happening under the guise of this religion that so closely mirrors the predominant one. If I could have some sort of legislation, it would be to prosecute and go after the people who are doing this, to actually really go after them, to stop these people, to stop throwing it out and, it was religious choice and stuff like that. There are so many young women who have tried to prosecute these men that married them when they were just babies, and nothing is happening. And it's ridiculous. Why are we not listening to the stories of these young girls and the young boys who have been beaten and kicked out? Warren Jeffs was finally prosecuted and convicted and is in Texas in prison, but it took a long time from what he had done. They didn't want to touch it, and that is what I see as the problem, is that because this state of mind, which has some amazing things and beautiful people, like I know we're ready for change, and I really so wish that they could take this more seriously, that this polygamy thing that they want to pretend never ever happened in the beginning time of their church, to acknowledge it, to move forward, and to look at what's going on now and say, this is not okay when these young children are involved and they're getting married. I understand the stickiness of, you can't necessarily go after adults. And, even though I don't believe that they really have a consensual relationship because of the polygamy, they are adults. And there's not necessarily anything you can do. And I understand that, because there are people who are really genuinely trying to live this in the way that they feel best, and are good people, and are, just trying to do what they believe in their heart is right for their religion. But when
we just need to extend a little more protections for the kids.
I completely agree. Yes, that's what I want. I want us to actually hear these victims and to hear these children, and to help, that we need to help protect them.
And so you're getting your PhD in psychophysiology. So let's wrap this up with you telling us what you plan to do with that degree.
Well, definitely doing, the research. I want to help women who have been victims of child sexual trauma. And of course, that's going to encompass a lot of polygamist women. I know a lot of them, and every single one of them have got a story. The ones that are my friends. And so that's what my research will be doing as I move forward when I get my PhD, because my school counseling degree doesn't allow me to do the kind of treatment and individual counseling on women and children like I want to. I will have to also get my licensure in clinical counseling. And so that I'll be hurrying up and doing after I finish my PhD. And all of this is so that I can get my certifications as a sex therapist as well, and to help these women find their voices again, find their sexuality again, to be able to heal from the horrors that have happened to them, and to be able to enjoy adult sexual lives that can bring them joy, and to help them recognize that what happened to them is the evil. It is not what can truly be enjoyed in an adult relationship. And of course, to help any children who come along that are suffering from this, so they can grow up into the healthy adults.
Well, your story is truly incredible, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to share that with us. And
of course,
we wish you luck with your endeavors, and we hope this gets out there, and a bunch of people can learn from the story and be inspired by it.
Thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciated you listening to me and giving me space and the voice to be able to do this. It really means a lot to me.
Absolutely.
Hey everyone, JT here. We hope you found Elaine's story as fascinating as we did, and we also hope it didn't hit close to home for you. But we know that for some listeners out there, it may have. So if it did, and you or someone you know has experienced or is experiencing a situation like this, we asked Elaine to recommend some resources that can help. The first of them is dovecenter.org. They are a shelter and advocacy and counseling resource for adults with or without children. They have safe and confidential shelter locations in the St. George, Utah area. But of course, they're networked in with all of the other shelters in the area and can help anyone no matter where you are. The second is holdingouthelp.org. They provide those who come from polygamous cultures the resources and assistance needed to transition from isolation to independence. And last but not least, OperationUndergroundRescue.org. Founded in 2013, they gathered the world's experts in extraction operations and in anti-child trafficking efforts to bring an end to child slavery. They have an underground jump team consisting of former CIA, Navy SEALs, and special ops guys that lead coordinated identification and extraction operations. They conduct these operations in conjunction with local law enforcement agencies all across the world, not just in the U.S. If you think these resources or Elaine's story can help someone, we absolutely encourage you to share it. If you have any questions about additional resources or about the show, please reach out to us at any of the contact methods on our website, biaspodcast.com. Thanks for listening.